Before Chinese expressways appeared on Uganda's maps, before the first multi-billion-dollar contracts were signed, before campaign ads began speaking of a new era of development, everything began with a quiet shift in how power was imagined. That shift did not start in Kampala, and it did not come from the fishing towns on the shores of Lake Victoria. It was born in Beijing's planning rooms, where officials and analysts began circling a question that would, in time, rearrange the global balance. How do you secure China's future in a world that is becoming steadily more unstable? At the beginning of the 21st century, China was expanding faster than any other economy on Earth. Factories ran day and night. Ports buckled under the weight of containers. Cities rose like organisms fed by concrete and steel. Yet beneath that boom sat a strategic vulnerability that was obvious to anyone thinking beyond a single electoral cycle. China needed raw materials, energy, and new markets. At the same time, it remained dependent on maritime trade routes whose security, indirectly but decisively, was shaped by Western navies, alliances, and the architecture of post-Cold War power. That is where the concept later branded as the Belt and Road, what many still call the New Silk Road, began to take form. It was never merely an infrastructure plan, it was an attempt to redesign the map of flows. The objective was not simply faster transport, it was the creation of alternative trade corridors capable of insulating China from geopolitical choke points, from strategic bottlenecks, and from the quiet coercion that can be exercised when a country's economic lifelines run through narrow passages patrolled by someone else. Africa, in this vision, was not an afterthought. It was a continent of future leverage, combining three elements that, together, created an almost perfect arena for long-horizon influence: vast natural resources, a rapidly growing population, and a chronic infrastructure deficit. For a state-building power through connectivity, that combination was not a humanitarian challenge. It was a strategic invitation. Uganda appeared on Beijing's radar not because it was the richest country in the region, nor the most stable. It mattered because it sat at the intersection of several strategic axes. It was a gateway to the Great Lakes region, a hinterland of resources and potential production, and a plausible transit node linking the interior of the continent to the ports of the Indian Ocean. For Beijing, Uganda's current position was less important than its potential role inside a future trade architecture, an architecture designed to outlast political moods, leadership changes, and the churn of short-term crises. The first engagements were diplomatic, symbolic, carefully staged: delegations, state visits, partnership declarations, joint press conferences. The optics were deliberate, a new chapter in South-South cooperation. China presented itself as a country that had climbed from poverty to development within a single generation and now sought to share that experience. For many African elites, accustomed to decades of Western conditionality, lectures, and what they perceived as condescension, that message landed. But behind the speeches, concrete offers arrived quickly: infrastructure loans, investment packages, ready-to-execute construction blueprints. Unlike Western financial institutions, Chinese state banks did not demand protracted structural reforms or politically complex auditing frameworks as a precondition for capital. Instead, they offered a clean, disciplined bargain. We finance and build. You provide guarantees, stability, and the credibility that contracts will hold. For Uganda, a country long constrained by infrastructure gaps, the offer was hard to refuse. Roads were needed to connect agricultural regions to markets. Reliable energy was needed to power industrial growth. A modern airport was needed to attract investors and tourists. None of those needs were theoretical. They were immediate, visible, and politically urgent. The earliest Chinese projects were not yet spectacular. They focused on upgrading existing roads, building smaller infrastructure assets, and delivering equipment. But even then, a pattern emerged, one that would later harden into a standard operating model. Financing came from Chinese institutions. Execution went to Chinese firms. Technology and materials were imported from China. Uganda received the finished product, but it also entered a relationship that slowly narrowed its technological autonomy and tightened its fiscal exposure. In Kampala, the process was sold as a success. Politicians pointed to construction as evidence of competence. State media emphasized strategic partnership and national modernization. After years of stagnation, much of the public wanted to believe the story being told. Yet, under the surface of enthusiasm, early tensions began to show. Local contractors complained that Chinese firms were pushing them out of the construction market. Labor unions raised questions about working conditions on sites where Chinese technical staff often dominated. Economists warned that rapidly expanding debt could become a structural threat if projects failed to generate the returns used to justify them. Those voices, however, were drowned out by the speed of visible change. When new bridges rise and new roads cut through old bottlenecks, it is difficult to convince a population that development has a shadow side. Infrastructure seduces the imagination more powerfully than abstract charts of debt exposure. It offers something that can be touched, driven on, photographed, praised. Beijing understood that psychology perfectly. Visible development generates political capital, and political capital protects projects from critique. Every opening ceremony becomes a reinforcement ritual. Every ribbon cut in front of cameras becomes evidence that the partnership is working. Over time, the scale expanded. Strategic transport arteries moved from plans to procurement. The modernization of Entebbe began to take shape. Energy investments entered the conversation. Uganda stopped being one partner among many and started to look, from Beijing's perspective, like a key tile in a regional mosaic. And in Beijing, these decisions were not isolated. East Africa was being imagined as a pillar in a broader global network. One that, in the long run, would help secure access to resources, stabilize supply chains, and create new markets for Chinese goods and standards. Uganda, given its geography, fit the blueprint with uncomfortable elegance. This was the moment the relationship ceased to be merely economic and began to acquire geopolitical weight. Each new infrastructure project increased China's presence in the region, deepened its access to local elites, and created dependencies designed to outlast elections, cabinet reshuffles, and internal political storms. Uganda stepped into this era hoping for development, not yet fully aware that it was stepping into a system governed by its own rules, rules shaped by long horizon strategy, asymmetries of capital, and a quiet logic of power. And this is where the real story begins, because the dragon did not enter Africa in a burst of violence or conquest. It arrived slowly, patiently, methodically, project by project, building its presence in such a way that no one could point to a single day and say, this is the moment cooperation began to turn into dependency. The turning point did not arrive in the form of a grand speech or a geopolitical manifesto. It came as an administrative decision that, on paper, looked almost banal. A new road linking Kampala to Entebbe International Airport. For the average citizen, it was a practical matter. Shorter commutes, fewer traffic jams, faster movement of goods. For politicians, it was an image project, a modern ribbon to cut for cameras. For China, it was the first true infrastructure foothold, designed to prove that Beijing could do more than promise. It could build, quickly, at scale, and with an efficiency that made alternative models look slow and exhausted. When the Kampala and Entebbe Expressway was approved, government documents carried the familiar language of development policy: modernization, regional integration, improved competitiveness. Yet the road's significance exceeded official messaging. It linked the country's political center to its main gateway to the world. It created a logistics spine that, from day one, was built not only for local needs, but for future international flows. Flows that would reshape how Uganda connected to the region and how the region connected to the world. Construction moved fast, faster than many comparable projects financed through Western mechanisms. The sites filled with heavy machinery, containerized materials, and engineering teams operating on schedules set by the contractor. The pace itself became part of the success narrative. Media coverage turned progress into a serialized spectacle. Politicians posed against unfinished overpasses as if infrastructure were not merely concrete, but proof of legitimacy. Yet beneath that visible competence sat the underlying model that would later become normal. Financing came through external debt. The lead contractor was a Chinese state-linked firm. A significant share of technology and materials was imported. This created a closed loop in which much of the money circulated back toward the creditor's economy. Uganda gained infrastructure, but it also assumed a long-term debt obligation that would be serviced over decades, long after the officials cutting the ribbon had moved on. For ordinary Ugandans, none of that mattered on opening day. What mattered was the result. A wide, modern roadway became a symbol of a new Uganda, one that looked, for the first time, like a country aspiring to regional leadership rather than merely surviving. The Expressway altered perceptions. Investors noticed. Partners adjusted their expectations. Kampala began to be narrated as a city entering a new phase of development, a capital stepping out of infrastructural scarcity into something that resembled capacity. This is where Beijing achieved something strategically priceless. It built a visible emblem of presence that simultaneously became a domestic political tool for Uganda's leadership. Every government press conference about development reinforced the story of effective cooperation with China. Every completed segment weakened critics who warned about debt accumulation and long-term exposure. Success in this framework was not only economic, it was rhetorical. It was a shield. The Expressway also began to reshape the economic landscape around it. New developments appeared along the route: warehouses, logistics centers, residential projects, commercial zones. Land values rose. Real estate speculation became a fresh source of elite wealth. Infrastructure began to generate its own economic gravity, and that gravity reinforced its political importance. Once a new corridor becomes a profit engine, the coalition of actors who depend on it for advantage grows larger and louder. For Beijing, this was confirmation that the model worked. One project unlocked the next. After the road came airport modernization, energy investments, rail planning. Each new contract strengthened China's position as Uganda's primary development partner. The relationship began to look less like a series of deals and more like a system, interlocking, cumulative, difficult to reverse without creating disruption. At the same time, serious controversies began to surface. Critics questioned project costs, arguing they were higher than similar investments elsewhere. Others raised concerns about procurement transparency and the actual benefits for local labor markets. The government responded with a familiar defense: the price of development is always high, and infrastructure pays back over the long term. But this was the point at which the debate stopped being purely economic and began brushing against sovereignty. Questions emerged about who truly controlled strategic infrastructure assets and what contractual arrangements meant during crises. Official answers were calming, yet incomplete disclosure fed a growing sense of uncertainty. Where transparency ends, speculation begins. And when infrastructure becomes strategic, speculation becomes politically explosive. China responded in a characteristic way. It did not engage in open media conflict. It reinforced presence through additional projects and soft power initiatives, scholarships, technical training, exchange programs. The intent was structural, to build a layered architecture of influence where hard infrastructure, steel and asphalt, was accompanied by soft integration through education, administration, and personal networks. Roads would anchor mobility, power plants would anchor dependence, institutions and relationships would anchor permanence. Uganda gradually adapted to that presence. Chinese firms stopped being perceived as temporary foreign contractors and began to feel like part of the economic landscape. Normal, expected, embedded. And that normalization is one of the most consequential stages in building long-term influence, because real power is not only the ability to impose, it is the ability to make one's presence unquestioned, unremarkable, treated as a natural feature of reality. The Kampala and Entebbe Expressway, then, was more than infrastructure. It was the first material proof that a new model of partnership could function, and that China could translate global ambition into concrete structures on African soil. It was the moment the dragon stopped being an abstract metaphor and became physically present, written into Uganda's landscape in asphalt, concrete, and contracts designed to outlive shifting governments and recycled political slogans. After the early infrastructure victories, China stopped viewing Uganda solely as a construction site for roads and bridges. In Beijing, a deeper conclusion took hold. Real influence over a region's future would not rest on transport alone. It would rest on energy and finance, because those domains determine whether a state can develop on its own terms or must calibrate its growth to external interests. Energy became the next frontier. Uganda, a country with major hydropower potential and rising demand, was an ideal target. Alongside road expansion came plans for power plants, transmission networks, and grid modernization. Official messaging emphasized expanded access, rural electrification, and reduced dependence on imported fuels. The promise was simple. Energy would unlock industry, investment, and a better quality of life. In practice, it meant more credit facilities, more contracts, and deeper technological entanglement. Chinese firms did not merely build power assets, they supplied control systems, turbines, transformers, and the software that managed the grid. This is where invisible infrastructure began to matter. The systems you do not see in drone shots, but that determine who can control, repair, and optimize a nation's energy flow. For Uganda, this was a genuine leap forward. More stable electricity could support manufacturing, attract investors, and improve urban life. Yet the energy system also became increasingly dependent on foreign technologies, servicing arrangements, and spare parts. Every failure, upgrade, or expansion naturally drew Uganda back to the same suppliers who had built the system in the first place. Here lies a core feature of modern dominance. It does not require formal ownership. It requires technical structures that make switching partners expensive, complicated, and politically risky. When an entire grid is built around one standard, shifting to another is not a procurement choice. It is a systemic conversion. Hardware replacement, workforce retraining, procedural redesign, and contract renegotiation, all at once, under pressure, and often in the middle of political scrutiny. Parallel to energy expansion, financial presence deepened. Chinese state banks became the primary lenders behind key Ugandan projects. With loans came financing mechanisms that locked the state into long-term repayment cycles. Installments scheduled across decades formed a steady stream of dependence that extended far beyond electoral horizons. For Kampala, this was politically convenient. It allowed ambitious projects without immediate tax hikes or disruptive fiscal reforms. Development could be financed through debt, while political costs were pushed forward in time. But deferral has a price. Future governments and future generations inherit the weight of decisions made in earlier moments of optimism, when the benefits were vivid and the repayment schedules still felt distant. At the same time, Chinese companies began to penetrate deeper into local banking, insurance, and trade ecosystems. Credit lines appeared for firms working with Chinese contractors. Preferential financing supported equipment imports. Funding programs reinforced cooperation inside a single economic ecosystem. A network formed that bound not only the state but also large parts of the private sector to the same external gravity. For many Ugandan entrepreneurs, this looked like opportunity. Access to capital and technology opened doors that local firms previously could not reach. Yet cooperation often occurred on terms favoring external partners. Local businesses became subcontractors inside a system whose key decisions were made beyond national borders. At this point, China's relationship with Uganda began to resemble a center-periphery model, though in a more subtle modern form. The center delivered capital, standards, and technology. The periphery supplied market access, resources, and space for expansion. The difference was rhetorical. The entire arrangement was packaged in the language of partnership and mutual benefit, making it easier to defend politically and easier to normalize socially. On the ground, these changes were felt unevenly. Cities saw new jobs, but often low-paid and unstable. Rural areas gained better access to electricity, yet not always the durable local economic transformation people expected. The divide between regions connected to new investment corridors and those left outside them became more visible and more politically sensitive. The state attempted to manage perception by highlighting successes and minimizing fractures. Official narratives emphasized a civilizational leap and a historic opportunity. In private, anxieties grew about the speed of borrowing and the expanding technological dependency. Those anxieties rarely reached the public sphere because they were politically inconvenient in a moment when visible development was the government's central story. China watched with characteristic patience. There was no rush toward theatrical dominance. Instead, presence expanded steadily, project by project, sector by sector. Each new contract strengthened Beijing's position as the indispensable development partner, the one actor without whom Uganda's next phase of growth became harder to imagine. This was the stage at which the dragon stopped being a road builder and became a system architect. It linked physical infrastructure to financial infrastructure and technological infrastructure, producing a mesh of dependencies far more difficult to cut than any single construction agreement. Uganda found itself in a position where development was increasingly tied to one source of capital and standards. That did not yet mean a loss of control, but it did mean a shift in the balance of power. The more key sectors were anchored to one partner, the narrower the space for independent economic policy became. And at this point, it became clear that the story of China in Uganda was no longer a story of isolated investments. It became the story of a new power arrangement, slow, methodical, almost invisible while it is forming, and deeply consequential once it hardens. The moment Uganda stopped being treated merely as a developing country and began to be discussed as a piece of the global chessboard was never announced in an official communiqué. It emerged gradually, quietly, inside think tank briefs, investment bank reports, and internal planning documents circulating between capitals. East Africa stopped being a blank space on strategic maps and began to be drawn as a future corridor of influence. For Beijing, this was confirmation that the strategy was working. After years of infrastructure, energy, and financial integration, Uganda functioned as a stable anchor for broader regional plans. Projects in Kampala were no longer treated as local initiatives. They were increasingly connected to plans involving neighboring states, Kenya, Tanzania, Rwanda, forming a network in which countries were no longer isolated partners, but nodes inside one system. In practical terms, Uganda's decisions began to matter beyond its borders. New roads and energy links reshaped regional trade routes. Investment choices were analyzed for their implications across East Africa. Uganda became a test case. How far could the infrastructure loan model be pushed without triggering serious political turbulence? That was when other actors began to move more actively. Western embassies, financial institutions, and international organizations intensified monitoring. Warnings appeared about concentrated debt exposure and over-reliance on a single partner. Official language emphasized diversification. unofficial language increasingly spoke of geopolitical competition. Uganda entered a reality where every major investment decision was interpreted not only as an economic choice, but as a political signal. Signing a new Chinese contract was read as strengthening an Eastern vector. Engaging Western institutions was scrutinized to see whether it constituted a real alternative or merely a negotiating tactic. Kampala tried to balance these pressures, emphasizing neutrality and pragmatism. Officially, Uganda pursued a multi-vector foreign policy, cooperating with anyone offering tangible benefits. But in practice, infrastructure weight and financial gravity steadily pulled the center of mass toward Beijing. During this period, Chinese diplomacy grew more assertive. High-level visits, framework agreements, and renewed declarations of strategic partnership carried more than symbolic value. They signaled that Uganda had been written into a long-term regional strategy. China no longer treated it as just another recipient of capital, but as a stable pillar of its East African presence. For Ugandan elites, this offered internal advantages. Close ties with a powerful partner increased political leverage and created access to new funding streams. Yet the risk grew that national policy would become increasingly shaped by external interests. Socially, the shift was felt indirectly. People saw projects rise, they heard of new investments, they watched cities change. But increasingly, there was also a sense that the tempo of transformation was being set elsewhere, and that the key decisions were being made in rooms ordinary citizens could not enter. Here, Uganda began to resemble the classic dilemma of developing states under globalization: how to use foreign capital without losing control of the future, how to accelerate development without handing key sectors to external actors, how to build infrastructure without building structural dependence. China did not change course. Its strategy operated on a long-time horizon in which temporary crises and social unrest were treated less as systemic threats and more as predictable turbulence in a transformation process. Beijing played for time, confident that infrastructure, loans, and technological lock-in build durable foundations of influence. Uganda, meanwhile, began to feel the weight of the game. It benefited from development, yet saw its autonomy narrowing. Attempts to renegotiate terms carried the risk of financial destabilization. Project delays carried economic and political costs. Choices became heavier. And this is where the first act closes. The dragon entered Africa not as an invader, but as a development partner. It built roads, power systems, and financial channels. It embedded itself so effectively that its presence became part of the state's everyday functioning. But this is only the beginning, because the real test of the relationship begins when Uganda is forced to answer the hard question: can it convert this cooperation into its own national strength, or will it become one component in a larger system where the decisive moves are made far beyond its borders?